Hey guys, welcome to this week's episode of Hormonally Speaking. Super pumped today to talk to this guest because we talked a little bit about environmental toxins on the podcast, but it's such a big important topic that a lot of women are missing in their arsenal of dealing with hormonal disruption. Particularly, I work with a lot of women in perimenopause, and not that it becomes more important, but when you're starting to have crazy shifting hormones, I really see how these chemicals can impact us even more. So we're going to dive in today with an expert in this area, and her name is Lara Adler, and she's a certified holistic health coach and a self-educated environmental toxins expert. She's been featured on over a dozen summits, dozens of podcasts, and appeared in a 9-part documentary film series viewed by millions around the world. She is a member of the Naturopathic Association of Environmental Medicine and the American Holistic Health Association. She's attended lectures and symposiums presented by highly respected institutions like the New York Academy of Sciences and the Mount Sinai Children's Environmental Health Center, and by many of the top names in epigenetics, hormone disruption, and environmental health on topics ranging from prenatal chemical exposures to environmental chemicals' impact on the developing brain. You can find her at her website, laraadler.com, where she offers online courses, or on Instagram at Environmental Toxins Nerd, and on Facebook at Lara Adler HHC. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm excited to dive in. This topic is kind of the cornerstone of why the topic of environmental health is so important. So
yeah.
happy to be here.
Yeah. So excited to hear about, all of these different layers that can, come into play. But let's start off actually with how you got into this work in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a little bit of a different story. I think a lot of people come into whatever their area is in the health space because they had their own health challenge that they overcame. Like that's not at all what happened for me. I didn't have any toxic exposures or anything that kind of turned me onto this space. I just was always interested in health and nutrition and wellness from, an age when it was like really dorky to be into that stuff. And, long story short, ultimately had a left turn career change and then moved into this space of health coaching, this holistic health coaching. And it was even through all of the years that I'd spent reading just for my own personal interest, and then going through this nutrition program, like there was really no mention of environmental toxicity beyond saying things like pesticides are bad.
Right.
And eat organic. And like, that was kind of the extent of it. And I was like, okay. And then as I started doing work as a health coach, and I was working primarily with people that were looking to lose weight, most of my clients they lost weight, they kept it off, they did all the things, check, great. And then I had like a couple clients that they did all those things and their weight really didn't budge at all. And they were super frustrated because they were doing all the things. And then I was super frustrated, especially as a new health coach. I felt pretty responsible to figure it out for them and to get them a win. And so I said, okay, well, what am I missing? Because I'm clearly, like, they've managed their stress, they're sleeping better, they're minimizing their sugar and processed foods, they're eating more vegetables, like they're drinking more water, like they're exercising appropriately, right? Like, and I was like, okay, there's got to be something here that I'm not considering, that I don't know about. And so I started digging into, what are some of the factors behind weight gain and resistant weight loss. And that's really where I stumbled into this field of environmental health and learning that, there's an entire class of chemicals called obesogens, which are metabolic disruptors. And these are chemicals that are found in consumer products that we're exposed to every single day. And, it really kind of blew my hair back because, like I said, at that point, just personally, and then within this sort of new career venture, at that point had spent close to 15 years reading all the books I could on health and nutrition. And I was like, well, wait a second, if this is such a big deal, which the research that I'm reading seems to indicate that it is, why is this not part of the dialogue? And so that was kind of happening. And then at the same time, my sister-in-law was pregnant with my niece, and I was researching, hey, what are the what's a healthy, safe baby mattress?
Mm-hmm,
And that
mm-hmm.
sort of steered me towards the direction of looking at consumer products just from what is the exposures that we're getting, regardless of whatever, and then figuring out going back into it, what are the potential health risks and what are the concerns there? And that also just blew my hair back because I was
rabbit hole, right?
And so I spent a couple of years going to all of these lectures and symposiums and conferences and talking to scientists. And I was grateful to have a couple of friends in the science field.
Mm-hmm.
So I was, kind of self-teaching myself, okay, I want to make sure I'm understanding this before I start talking to other people. I want to make sure I'm getting this right.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would have them read the papers and then say like, okay, this is is that correct? Mm-hmm. And so I was able to kind of go through that sort of self-education process to really understand, okay, there's a lot that we don't know. There's a lot that we can't do, but what does the research say about what is the risk? And what are the things that we can do? And that really became something that I just was like, this is what I'm passionate about talking about. I just want to do this because it's fascinating, but it's also infuriating. Like all of these emotions.
Yeah.
And then, I think what happens when we're, and maybe you experience this with the people that you work with, but, when it comes to certain aspects of health, especially when it's around weight or even sometimes maybe around hormones, people are kind of deaf to it's diet and exercise, because that's been the prevailing framework for decades. And so when they start learning about something new that's not a result of a choice they made, they start going, well, wait a second, this is not something that I did.
Right.
This is something that was done to me without my knowledge or understanding. And I think people they lean in a little in a different way because they're like, oh, I've never heard that before. And those other things I continue to struggle with. And so maybe I'm going to just lean in and listen a little bit closer. And I'm grateful for that because it allows people to kind of hear information about a topic that most people are just really happy to dismiss because they don't want to have to think about it. Right.
You want to be checked out about it. Yeah, absolutely. And, I see in my practice, I think the two biggest factors for hormonal disruption is stress. We're just way too much going on. I talk about this a lot. And then environmental toxins, because even if you're eating the quote unquote perfect diet, you're still getting
and the same can be
pesticides
said,
in food.
And to me, it's like they're all kind of on equal footing because the same could be said, like you could have a fully, clean, low tox life and lifestyle, but if your sleep is garbage, well, your hormones are going to be trash. Or if you're ultra stressed out, your hormones are still like, it's not one thing, it's all of these things. And so I think anybody who's working around hormones by default has to take this really multi-pronged approach to say, okay, well, we're going to do these things in tandem. And like I was saying, most people, when you start saying, okay, well, we're going to talk about food and movement, they're like, okay. And then you're like, and now let's talk about sleep. And they're like, huh? Okay, sure. That makes a little sense. And then you start going, let's talk about your shampoo. And they're like, okay, why? Exactly. And so the task becomes more complicated for the practitioner or health professional, because we have to just explain this really abstract concept that is frankly, it is really an abstract concept because these are not things that we can see or smell or taste.
They smell good usually.
Yeah, they smell good, right? And so I think that's pretty subjective because I think a lot of things that other people think smell good, I think smells like hot garbage. So that's subjective.
They're trying to make it smell good at least.
Yes, yeah. And so I think there is this sort of hump that people have to get over to say, okay, that makes sense. And that makes sense is really contingent upon how we are able to articulate this connection. Because if they don't get the connection, they're just like, I don't know. My
Right.
doctor's telling me to take out change my shampoo. I don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Right. And so that part of the conversation, I think, is really important for health professionals to nail, because it is what connects the dots for people.
Right.
That this is a real thing, that this is a significant concern.
Yeah. So on that note, can you explain to us exactly how these chemicals are impacting our hormones?
Yeah. So I'm actually going to back up and start with some basic concepts that I always think is really important to hit to contextualize, and B, to kind of just preface everything going forward. So one, everything is a chemical. Everything is a chemical. So like, I just want to put that out there, because there's always people that are like, ooh, everything is okay. Yes, everything is a chemical. And so in the field of environmental health, we are not concerning ourselves with all chemicals. We are specifically looking at the chemicals that are known or suspected to be harmful to humans, to animals, to the ecosystem. That is what we're looking at. And so our hormones are chemicals. The air we breathe, the water we drink, everything is a chemical, right?
Our hormones are chemical messengers. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
Everything is a chemical. And so going forward, now that that's established, when I say the word chemical, I'm not talking about any chemical or all chemicals. We're specifically talking about this subcategory of ones that are or are suspected of being harmful in some way. So there's that first component. The second thing that I think people need to recognize and kind of shift their mindset and thinking about, especially when we use the phrase toxic chemical, is like, well, what do we mean by that? What does that actually mean? Most people, when they hear the phrase toxic chemical, are thinking of something that is going to cause an acute reaction that is going to require a trip to the emergency
room. A dump, like a chemical dump or something like that.
Like I work in a factory, I got exposed, my skin is blistering, or like my kid drank some household cleaner under the sink, or my dumb kid ate a Tide Pod because the internet told him to, right? Like those are the situations where like, okay, I have to call a medical professional for immediate intervention. So that's what most people think about when they're thinking of toxicity. And so that is in fact toxicity, but that is acute toxicity. And so in the field of environmental health, primarily, not exclusively, but primarily what we're looking at is chronic toxicity, which is low level of exposure that on its own, not a big deal, but a little bit every day, all day for 5, 10, 20, 60, 70 years can be problematic. And that is really where this whole conversation about endocrine disrupting chemicals sort of diverts from the conventional view of toxicity, right? It really takes a hard left turn, specifically with chemicals that disrupt the endocrine system, the hormonal system, because when you have chemicals that are bioactive, meaning the body responds to them at the same or similar levels that our body is naturally designed to, or to respond to, that's where we have problems. And so, you mentioned earlier that hormones are communication messengers, right? And so the way that I explain it is that our hormones communicate in whispers. It's just a tiny amount. The levels of hormones that are circulating through our body, even during times of hormonal transition, is like infinitesimally small. This is like parts per trillion levels, extremely low. And that's the way the body was designed to function. And so with these synthetic chemicals, or even there are some, natural heavy metals that are metalloestrogens, so it's not just synthetics. They confuse the body, and they kind of masquerade as these hormones that our bodies already know what to do with at similar frequency or volume, to use that same sound analogy. And so this concept of really low levels of exposure, so low dose environmental exposures to endocrine disrupting chemicals, unfortunately, in the general medical space is still not accepted as real. However, you talk to any endocrinologist and you talk to any pharmacologist, And they will they will tell you that as a point of fact of how human physiology works, is that specifically when it comes to hormones, it is those extremely low doses that are the most impactful.
Yeah.
That is the biggest deal, because if, we have finite estrogen receptors, or if we just to pick one. So when you fill all of those receptor slots, more estrogen or more synthetic estrogen isn't going to do more things. All the slots are filled. So it can do other things. It can be toxic in other ways, but from a endocrine interference perspective, once those receptor slots are filled, like, okay, well, you can't fit any more in, that's it. And so when you have those really low levels of exposure, that is where we start seeing some of the significant problems. And unfortunately, the field of toxicology is still, this is very much a old boys club of, this is how we've been doing it since the 16th century. And we don't want to change, because if we do, then that means we have to admit that everything that we've known about the way that chemicals behave, or certain chemicals behave, is wrong. And we have egos, so we don't like to do that. And so they really actually dig in their heels around whether or not low dose exposures are actually meaningful. And that's wild to me, especially because all of our regulatory decisions that deem whether or not a product is safe or not to be sold in the marketplace are based on outdated toxicology approaches. So this is there's just a huge problem. And so until we can get that changed on a broad scale, we are still going to be fighting this battle of convincing or redefining what we mean by safe or toxic. A big area of kind of tension in the different fields of sciences.
Right. And there's new chemicals being introduced every year, right? New toxic chemicals. Yeah.
Yes.
So it's compounding the situation.
Yeah. And there's, we have the numbers that are thrown around, at least in the United States, and these are not super accurate numbers, but they are just sort of rough ballparks. 84,000 chemicals on the registry in the United States for use. Only about 200 of those have been adequately tested for safety. The adequate, for me, that phrase, that's an asterisk small print, really, because they're not looking at them at low dose exposures. That is not how toxicology testing is done. So if, we look at how most toxicological research is done when they're looking at the toxicity of a chemical, they start with exposing typically, animals, rodents, whatever, mice, rats, to an extraordinarily high level of a chemical, maybe 1,000 or even 10,000 times higher than what we would encounter in real life. And part of that is just to get a baseline, elicit a response. Let's just see.
Right.
Worst case scenario, somebody drowns in I always think of I think it was an 80s or early 90s, I think it was an 80s movie, The Toxic Avenger, where some guy falls into a vat of toxic waste and turns into a monster. Yeah, I should probably revisit that movie for work purposes. But this is where you have OSHA comes in, Occupational Safety and Health Administration. And so, we need that high level toxicology data for worst case scenarios for employment. If you work in a warehouse, you work in a factory, you work in whatever. And so in toxicology research, they're looking at those really high exposures, and then they kind of start working their way down to find lower and lower doses. And what they're looking for are sort of two or three endpoints. They're looking at the low L and the no L. So the low L is the lowest observed adverse effect level. So what that means is it's the lowest level that they found so far that causes an adverse effect. And I'm going to thumbtack adverse effect. Okay. Then they're going down further. So, okay, let's keep going lower and lower until they reach what they call the no L, which is the no observed adverse effect level. We don't see anything bad here. Then they add in a margin of safety, right? Let's just go a little further just to be on the safe side. And then we designate this is the level that's safe. The problem is, one, they never actually test this level directly. They don't. And then they don't test anything below it
Mm-hmm.
because they are making an assumption that this exposure follows the 16th century adage of the dose makes the poison,
Mm-hmm.
right? That everything is a poison. It's the dose that determines whether or not something is toxic. And for most exposures, that's true,
Mm-hmm.
right? Radiation, more is way worse than a little bit. We can fly in an airplane. You can eat a banana. A banana
Right.
has potassium iodide, it's a radiation.
Mm-hmm.
Fine, no big deal. Body can handle it. Lot of radiation. Well, you're just going to die.
Right.
Sorry,
Straight up.
That's super toxic.
Yeah.
Going to kill you.
Mm-hmm.
And so the assumption is that everything follows that path, and specifically endocrine disrupting chemicals are the thing that kind of blows that framework out of the water.
Mm-hmm.
Because they respond differently. So if we picture that same graph and we get to the low L and the no L, and then that margin of safety and then the safe level,
Mm-hmm.
and then we go down here at these really low exposures, oftentimes this portion of the graph
Mm-hmm.
might look linear, right? It might look like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
at this point, more is worse. But when we get down here, the behavior of the sine curve, the line, can change. And so and it can change in what's referred to as a non-monotonic dose response curve, or non-monotonicity. So monotonicity is, it's predictable, it goes up, more is bad, less is better, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
So it's predictable. But when you get into these low levels of endocrine disrupting chemicals, it becomes unpredictable. A little bit might not be a problem. A little bit more might be way worse. And then a little bit more might not be bad at all. So that's a bell curve.
Interesting. Yeah.
Right. And so tamoxifen is actually a good example of this. Tamoxifen is a breast cancer drug.
Okay.
And it has a very well-established non-monotonic dose response curve,
Mm-hmm.
which toxicology, by the way, says doesn't exist.
You're like, except for this situation.
Except for this, which we like is well established and we all know it. And so what happens is, people who are undergoing breast cancer treatment, who are put on tamoxifen, experience what's called a tamoxifen flare up here,
right?
Where the tamoxifen is actually stimulating breast cancer growth. And it's painful, and it's a painful flare period. And then only when you get to a higher amount does the tamoxifen actually start to work.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is a bell-shaped, non-monotonic, non-predictable dose response curve from a chemical that is bioactive in the human body. So it's like, why toxicologists are still arguing whether or not this is real doesn't make any sense to me. So
right.
We have enough evidence.
Yeah.
There's plenty of evidence to demonstrate this. So the last point I want to make here, and then I can get into some of the specifics of mechanisms, is to go back to my comment about thumbtacking. What do we mean by an adverse effect? So in toxicology, primarily the adverse effects are things like tumors, changes in organ weight. They're like gross histological changes, death, right? Those are the adverse effects. We are not even looking at endpoints of slight fluctuations in hormones that might lead to reduced fertility. They're not looking at things that are the real lived experience, like the endpoints of the real lived experience of people and the chronic conditions that we have, or those things that we experience that we all think are normal because they're common, but are not in fact normal. Right. And so if we're not looking at those endpoints, those subtle endpoints that are impacted by these low level of exposures, we're just not getting the full picture of
so much
adverse effect. Right. And so that's kind of doubles down on why I said that most of the testing that we do have, the adequate testing that we do have, is not adequate. It's not even, in fact, it's not even near. It's better than nothing.
Right.
But it's not adequate. And so, this really would require a massive paradigm shift in how research is done. And there are certainly some people advocating for that, but that is a, massive ship to try to turn around. Yeah. And
especially with the amount of chemicals out there. So when you said 84,000, is that all together, or is that how many are coming out per year?
No. That's only for the United States.
Okay.
So the figure globally, this was a new study that was just a couple months old. globally, the figure used to be 150,000 chemicals registered worldwide. The reason why it's a ballpark is different countries have different policies to track and monitor. Some countries have no policies to track and monitor. And so it's just kind of a big guesstimate. There was an analysis done just a couple months ago that was like, oh, okay, so it looks like that number is closer to 350,000. But like we grossly underestimated the amount of chemicals in production or in use globally. And so, you know, our first chemical policy in the United States was passed in 1976. It was the Toxic Substances Control Act to regulate chemicals in commerce. At the time, there were about 62,000 chemicals already in use in the United States, and they got a rubber stamp free pass.
Of course. We won't count those.
So we're just going to like assume that those are legit and fine. Right. We don't have to do anything. And so the number then from the 1970s, mid 1970s to around now is, okay, so we've added about 20,000-ish new chemicals to the marketplace. The problem with the TSCA registry, which is the Toxic Substances Control Act, is, you know, it's kind of like Hotel California, like you check in, but you don't check out. So once you're on the list, you're on the list, even if that chemical is not being used anymore.
Okay.
And so it's just not an accurate,
not helpful.
We just don't know. Right. And so, you know, this is an area where we really need better policy around how chemicals are monitored and regulated, not only in this country, but globally, so that we even know what's out there. What's on the docket. And then there's all kinds of other, you know, things that the chemical industry does to, you know, they have things called confidential business information or CBI claims. CBI claims basically shroud any information about their chemical under a confidentiality clause. So like it's confidential business, you know,
so
it's a trade
secret.
It's
not registered then.
It's just a black hole and no one can know about it.
Right.
Like even staff members at the EPA are not allowed to know what's in these chemicals under CBI claims. CBI claims are going down. They're not as many as there used to be because the EPA is trying to get rid of them. But they're not disallowed. And so people can still file them. So, you know, all of this to say is, you know, this is a much bigger topic. It's not just about what am I being exposed to in my shampoo. It's political, it's geopolitical, it's a global problem. And this is part of why I find it so fascinating, because there are 1,000 rabbit holes that you can go down into to kind of make sense of this puzzle of how all these pieces fit together and why we have poor regulation and why we even have to have this conversation in the first place, right? And so I feel like while it's not some people are like, just tell me what to do, just tell me what to eat. I feel like having at least somewhat of an understanding of how all of these things fit together can help people contextualize the scale and seriousness of the situation.
And it's true for so many health issues too, you know, I mean, there's so many layers to things, but when you start to see sort of the political impact on our health, you know, I think it empowers people in a different way, right? To make some different decisions and to be highly aware of what's going on, right? Because otherwise we're just walking blind, really.
Yeah. And, you know, I think, you know, certainly not everybody's interested in being, you know, an advocate and wanting to do advocacy work and activism work to change public policy. I think that if people feel so inclined, great. You know, at the end of the day, there's lots of different avenues that we can kind of do this work, so to speak. And that can be done on a selfish level, right? Like, well, I don't have time to do that. I'm busy, whatever. I'm going to leave that for people who are more politically inclined, but I'm going to vote with my dollars and I'm going to buy things that allow me to minimize my exposure. And that is a message that we send to industries
Mm-hmm.
to let them know, hey, we don't want that and we do want this. And that's hugely powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And, I know your audience is predominantly women,
Mm-hmm.
and I like to remind women that we actually are the primary household spenders. We are the primary spenders in society, period. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So if we look at the stats, certainly men might be the primary earners, but we are the primary spenders because we are head of household,
Mm-hmm.
and we are responsible for buying decisions for a vast majority of consumer products in the marketplace. So we have this massive
power.
right? Yeah. And we have to be reminded of that sometimes, and go, and then reminded of instances where those changes have actually, or that voting with your dollars or demanding better from industry and from manufacturers has changed the landscape. And it absolutely has. So, the reason why everybody's talking about BPA was because moms in the 1990s, I think it was the late 90s or early 2000s, discovered that there was BPA, bisphenol A, which is an endocrine disrupting chemical, was leaching out of plastic baby bottles into their milk, and they were pissed off.
Yeah.
Right.
Hit them with the babies, right? And that's
so then you had these women who were taking their children in their strollers. They refer to themselves as the stroller brigade. And they would roll it up on Congress's lawn. And what politician? It is career suicide for a politician to dismiss a group of moms and babies. And so that is why, not because any policy changed, but why baby bottle manufacturers ultimately were like, okay, we won't use bisphenol A in our products. The Consumer Product Safety Commission got involved, and they were like, okay, we're banning BPA from baby bottles. We think this is a smart move. Certainly these chemicals are in thousands of other places, so it wasn't an outright ban, but it just shows the power of consumers and women in particular saying, we don't want that. We want this instead. And you need to be transparent. And so this push for transparency in consumer products is also exploding. And I think this is very generational. So we've got this younger generation of people that are growing up with all of this. It's not like in the 70s and in the 80s where it was like, just put a smile on your face and pretend the lawn is fine and your clothes are fine, and everything that happens behind closed doors is we don't want to know about it. Right. So that was everything was opaque. And younger people are like, yeah, that's not cool with us. Yeah. And so I love
they're leading the change for sure.
Happy, inspired people that are like, you know what, we're going to do this differently. We're going to do it on our terms. And we have enough clout because our generation is big enough and growing that we can actually start writing the rules here. And so the landscape of consumer products has shifted so dramatically, not always for the better, but predominantly for the better. And it's really inspiring to see. So all of this is just to say, vote with your dollars. And it is impactful, even if you're only doing it for your own 100%.
That's the place to start. Yeah. Well, since you brought up BPA, I do have to ask, I know that they were all the things now say BPA free, but isn't the reality that there is other forms of similar chemicals that are in most of these things that have taken the place of BPA?
Yes, absolutely. So first of all, BPA as a chemical was first developed in 1891. So it has been around for a long ass time. And it was originally considered as a hormone replacement in medicine. And it was in the running for as a pharmaceutical, and it was actually beat out by diethylstilbestrol. Which diethylstilbestrol is a horrible chemical that was prescribed. It's a synthetic form of estrogen. It was prescribed to pregnant women between the 1940s and 1971 to prevent miscarriage and early birth. And any related complications in pregnancy. Turned out that it actually didn't do any of those.
I was going to say maybe cause those things.
It caused a little bit of those things. But it also had really devastating effects for children that were in utero while their mothers were taking it. And so BPA just wasn't quite strong enough of a synthetic estrogen, and diethylstilbestrol was. So just a little bit of context of where BPA is on its like historical timeline. So BPA didn't find its place in medicine. It found its place in plastics, in its uses primarily in polycarbonate plastics. It's used in lots of other materials, but in polycarbonate plastics, meaning your Nalgene bottle, your food processor container, your plastic blender carafe, that type of, it looks like glass. It's very rigid and sturdy. And BPA is used in plastics to add that sturdy. Yeah, it's a plasticizer meant to make something hard and rigid, versus a phthalate, which is another type of endocrine disrupting chemical. Its role in plastics is to make things soft and flexible, so like a garden hose or like a Halloween mask or something like that. And so BPA is one chemical in a family of chemicals called bisphenols, and there's many iterations of bisphenols. And so what a lot of companies did when consumers were demanding to get rid of BPA is they said, okay, we're listening. We hear you. We hear you. We're going to do you good.
We're doing the right thing.
We're doing the right thing by you. We care. And so they were like, great, no worries. We're going to get rid of BPA. Well, all they did was replace BPA with one of the sister chemicals, BPS or BPF, which are molecularly almost identical and therefore biologically are almost identical.
Right.
And new research, because these are newer chemicals that haven't been as well studied. And as we started seeing maybe BPA levels in some people going down, we're seeing BPS and BPF levels going up because of that replacement.
Yeah.
And so the research into those chemicals are finding that they are just as bad, if not worse, in terms of their hormonal activity and negative health associations. And so, you know, in this environmental health space, that is referred to as a regrettable substitution, where we swap one bad actor chemical with another. And there are many, many instances of this. Another big one are the C8 chemicals. C8 chemicals are those perfluoroalkyl substances, PFAS chemicals that are used in nonstick cookware, stain-resistant treatments, and all of that. And the first generation of those chemicals were referred to as C8, and C8 just means the number of carbon bonds that the chemical has. The more carbon bonds something has, the harder it is for that molecule to break apart. So that's why these are called forever chemicals, because they don't go anywhere. It's really, really hard to break apart 8 carbon bonds. And so people were like, hey, turns out we have all of these C8 chemicals in people and in wildlife. And turns out that that's bad. And so companies were like, okay, we're going to do C6 chemicals instead. So they just went from 8 carbon bonds to 6 carbon bonds. This is not that different. So it's not different enough for it to undo all of the health. They're still toxic. They're still bad. But this is where companies can, from a marketing perspective, in the same way that, you know, products are being marketed as BPA free, people can say, oh, we don't have these toxic C8 chemicals. We don't have PFOA or PTFE. It's like, well, great. Who cares? Because you have these other ones, which are just as bad and are also showing an increase in the human population because you're phasing one out and phasing another one in. And so it becomes, from a regulatory standpoint, this game of whack-a-mole.
Yeah.
You whack one down, another one comes up. And so there are scientists and advocacy groups and nonprofits that are really pushing to ban and restrict entire classes of chemicals rather than individual chemicals. And bisphenols is one of those, and flame retardants is another, and PFAS chemicals is another, because the properties of the chemicals in that class are so concerning regardless of the specific molecule.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah. And so BPA free, as I like to say, is BS. Like sometimes it might be. So I've seen, you know, glass jars marketed as BPA free. Well, of course, there's no, but that to me is, it's preying on the fact that consumers don't know what these molecules are. They don't know what that is. And they're like, well, we're just going to be able to charge you more money for that.
Exactly. Greenwashing, right?
It's greenwashing. And so, I've seen like sandwich baggies, like Ziploc style bags marketed as BPA free. Well, BPA is meant to make plastics rigid and hard.
Right. So why would they put it in there anyway?
In there in the first place. It's the same thing. We see this in skincare and personal care products, where you have some of these new companies that are coming out because they're hooking their wagon to this like natural, non-toxic. And they're like, we have a list of, 500 chemicals that we don't use in our products. And it's like, okay, well, 300 of those are literally not used in skincare products in the first place. At all. Like methamphetamines, like right. No one. And so they pad their list trying to. So that kind of behavior, I think, is so abhorrent because it really drags down the perception in the marketplace and the value of companies that are doing it right. But, that marketing is not unique to plastics. You look in the gluten-free space. All kinds of, this carrot is gluten-free. Well, should I hope so? The example that I give, and I just remember this would be probably about 15 years ago now, is Tropicana used to sell an orange juice that was marketed as cholesterol-free. And And I was like, okay, well,
I love me my fat-free.
I love me my cholesterol, which comes from animals.
Totally.
Isn't in my orange juice. Well, I should hope not.
Exactly. The oranges are not full of cholesterol.
And so, but this was during this like heart healthy craze when all the grocery stores had their like heart healthy labels on the shelves. And so companies, Tropicana was like, okay, well, I can charge 30 more cents for this carton of orange juice just because we stuck this.
Absolutely.
Modified the label with a little sticker that says it's cholesterol free, so that when some poor schlub comes from his cardiologist and the guy's like, well, you better watch your cholesterol.
He's like, sweet, I found cholesterol free orange juice.
Great, I'm winning. And I'm just like, oh gosh. So there is this, it's like this assumption and then playing towards that the consumer is dumb. And that also pisses me off because it's really taking advantage of the fact that we just don't have a good foundation of health education in this country, so that the vast majority of people, I mean, for years, my dad wouldn't eat avocados because he thought they were loaded with cholesterol.
Right. And eggs and all of those.
And I was like, oh man. And so, and then just science education in general, right? And so that lack of science education is that's rippling out in a lot of different areas and places right now.
For sure.
That illiteracy. But I think that, corporations, they maybe don't push for it, but they certainly benefit from absolutely. That by this sort of deceptive marketing. So anyway, we can get into endocrine disrupting chemicals because we haven't even really talked about that yet.
Right. And one of the things I want to talk about too is, where these sit in our body, because I don't think everybody knows that, on top of how they impact our endocrine system. So dive in.
So first I'll say, there's lots of different mechanisms or pathways. We're still figuring out what some of those are. What we're seeing is associations like, hey, we did, we're either seeing these things in animal studies and then seeing it repeated or showing up in epidemiological studies. We can't test chemicals on people.
Right.
I think that's obvious, but it bears saying out loud. And so what we do is we test chemicals on animals, and ideally we're doing those low dose exposures, and more science is being done in that way, which is wonderful because it's like, okay, this is actually comparable to the lived human experience of being exposed to these things. And so we're not testing directly on people, we test on animals, and then we look at epidemiological data, which is always imperfect, but it's what we have. Or we're looking at, some, whatever, mostly epidemiological data. And we're making inferences and saying, that's interesting because all of these things that we're seeing in animal studies are also showing up in the human population with these same factors in place. So we're making an educated assumption.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And that's just the imperfect nature of science. Right. And that's just how it works.
Right.
A lot of people like to zero in on that as a means of, well, I'm not a rodent, so that doesn't mean anything to me. It's like, okay, well, you're just telling me in that phrasing that you don't understand how science
how
works.
things are done. Yeah.
How things are done. So the point is that we're still learning a lot about how these chemicals are or may be affecting us. And one of the things that's being teased out is the specific mechanism. Like, where is this chemical docking? Where is it having an effect on the body? And how is that effect happening? And so that's still in discovery. But we do know that these endocrine disrupting chemicals can bind to or block they can block or partly, they can mimic or partly mimic the natural hormones that we have in our body, things like estrogen, thyroid hormones, and that can kind of turn on or turn off a hormone response or kind of set in motion a cascade of things in the body that maybe otherwise wouldn't have happened. They can bind to a receptor. I mentioned that earlier when we were talking about estrogen receptors, and they can block our natural hormones from binding. And they can interfere or block with the way that our natural hormones or their receptors are made or controlled, maybe by altering how they're metabolized in the liver. So those are the sort of primary mechanisms of action for endocrine disruption. There are others, but those are sort of the big ones. And, I think that when we're looking at some of the ways that they affect us, like you asked, or mentioned, where are they in the body? Well, that depends on whether or not they're fat soluble or not. If they're fat soluble, then they end up in our adipose tissue. And that kind of cycles back to, this first class of chemicals, these obesogens, most of which are also endocrine disrupting, can mess up our metabolism in ways that lead to weight gain. And so one of those mechanisms is sitting in our adipose tissue. And it's hypothesized that this is a protective defense mechanism by the body to say, like, we don't know what these baddies are. They seem like they could be harmful. We don't want them in our brain. We don't want them in our sensitive organs. So we're just going to sequester them in our fat tissue to kind of keep them locked up.
Doing harm, yeah.
And doing harm. And the problem is that, there's layers of problems here, right? Is that can actually end up triggering weight gain, because if you don't have enough adipose tissue to safely store those, the body's going to go, well, shoot, we better start putting some fat on as a place to store them.
Oh, I never thought about it that way.
So this also becomes a problem, and we see that mechanism, we see that happening when people undergo rapid weight loss. So, for example, people who undergo gastric bypass surgeries and have their caloric intake plummet, and they have really rapid weight loss, they actually get really sick.
It's really sick,
really sick. Why? Because their body is being flooded with decades worth of toxins that have been stored in their adipose tissue that their liver can't handle.
Oh, poor liver.
Poor liver, right? Yeah. And so, slow weight loss is ideal, right? So the body has time to process that. But what happens is during those periods of rapid weight loss where the body is really existing off those fat stores, right? Like it's burning off those fat stores as energy, and it's kind of cannibalizing all of that extra adipose tissue. From a lot of perspectives, we're like, great, that's excellent. Except those fat soluble toxins aren't an energy source. They don't get metabolized. They actually get recirculated back into the body. So now they're recirculating, this enterohepatic recirculation. Now they're going back around and they're
back
looking
to the
for
liver.
fat. And they're looking for fat.
Okay.
And they're like, well, shit, where do I go? Right? And if they don't have any fat, then they go into all your tissues and they make sick. And so then you kind of get that yo-yo effect of, well, I'm starting to put more weight on now. And so like that seems to be part of what's happening from those endocrine disrupting chemicals that behave in that way. There's also this fascinating mechanism called the PPAR gamma receptor. And the PPAR gamma receptor is like our master regulator of fat cell development in the body. And if PPAR gets activated in the presence of a fat cell, meaning a cell that's already a fat cell, PPAR is going to say, okay, well, we're going to start putting more fat into that cell to make it physically bigger. We're just going to change the cellular directions, so to speak. And so that's what happens for when PPAR is activated in the presence of a fat cell. When PPAR is activated in the presence of a stem cell, it actually changes the instructions for that stem cell to say, don't, and for some reason, it seems to be selective of sacrificing bone cells in favor of fat cells. I don't know why or what the implications of that are, but so instead of your stem cell, which is that like, well, you could be anything you want, you could be whatever you want when you grow up kind of cell, the body goes, okay, well, instead of being a skin cell or a liver cell or a bone cell, go be a fat cell. And so that actually increases the number of fat cells in the body.
Right.
And so now you have weight gain on a cellular level that has nothing to do with food or exercise or calories in, calories out. And we know this mechanism exists because there's so many pharmaceutical medications that have the side effect of weight gain. And many of them act on that PPAR gamma receptor, and that's how they do it.
Wow.
So when people are like, that's not possible for a chemical to make you fat, it's like, well, have you ever been on an antidepressant?
Right.
Because that's well-established, it's in every drug pickup insert. This is a potential side effect.
Fascinating. Wow.
So it's like a mechanism. This is kind of why I was saying earlier that if you talk to an endocrinologist or a pharmacologist, they have a whole different perspective on how, what are the toxicokinetics of a substance or a chemical in the body, and what are the effects. So
it's like, why don't these things go across the board?
Well, why don't these scientists speak to each other? And the thing is, that's frustrating is pharmacology and toxicology are on the same spectrum. They're just different ends. Pharmacology is the therapeutic dosage. Toxicology is the unsafe, unhealthy dosage, right? And so it's the same spectrum.
Yeah.
But if toxicology went down to this side of that graph, that's where pharmacology lives. So it's just wild to me that these fields of sciences don't communicate with each other.
Well, it's our unholistic approach, right, that we do in this culture so
and
much.
Then to add another layer to that, chemists, the field of chemistry, the people that are responsible for developing these novel molecules, many of which are great, right? Like we don't want to poo on all of chemistry, right? Because we live in a society where like I'm surrounded by modern chemistry and I'm grateful for it, right? And however, it is not part of the curriculum for chemists to learn about toxicology. They don't
it's crazy.
have any curriculum for the most part that talks about the environmental fate of the molecules that they're creating.
Wow.
And so this is where the field of green chemistry comes in, where green chemistry is like, okay, we need to do things differently because we've literally given no thought to the fate of thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of molecules that have been invented. And well, some of those are persistent and they're just sitting there, and we're always cleaning up the mess after the fact, whether it's DDT or organochlorine pesticides, other organochlorine pesticides being highly toxic. Like we're going, oh shoot.
Yeah.
All right. And so, well, maybe we could save ourselves a lot of heartache and suffering and death and cost and all of that by designing smarter molecules from the get-go.
Right. What that would be amazing.
That's another paradigm shift, right? And it's really hard for those paradigm shifts and for that sort of new framework of thinking. It's really hard for those to get traction, in the beginning, especially because they're often intentionally, laughed out of the science community, and that's common. And that's what happened. What we now know is the field of epigenetics, which is in particular transgenerational inherited epigenetics is what your grandparents and great grandparents did or ate or experienced can influence multiple generations down. And the guy, I don't remember his name, I think he was Swedish, some Scandinavian name, when he, in the 80s, when he was like, oh, I think I found something here, when he was looking at the Dutch hunger winter or Dutch
right.
right?
Yeah.
And so looking at, in this part of Northern Europe during the German invasion, there were food supplies that were cut off, and people had this winter time period where like they were dying of starvation. They were eating their leather shoes. Like it was desperate. And then they started looking, and these people took meticulous farming records. They took meticulous records on the health of their population, which is like a gold mine when it comes to epidemiological historical data. And so this guy was poring over all this data and was like, wait a second, the children who lived through that Dutch hunger winter, or the children of the children and grandchildren of people who were boys, young boys, for example, during that time period, or who were pregnant during that time period, have statistically significant increases in heart disease and diabetes as their children and grandchildren moved into adulthood. When that guy tried to publish his research, he got absolutely laughed out of the scientific community. It took him 20-something years.
Wow.
To get published.
Wow.
And now there is an entire field.
Everybody exactly is talking about
like these new ideas.
Yeah.
This is the cycle. It's like you get mocked and ridiculed.
Yeah.
Until enough people are like, hey, wait a second.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then they're like, okay, fine. But I'm not going to admit that I was wrong before. I'm just going to pretend that I discovered this new thing.
Right.
Anyway.
Yeah. Well, so we're running low on time, but I wanted to check in. I work with a lot of women in perimenopause, and, estrogen dominance is a big issue during this time. So one of the things that popped into my head while you were talking, I'm so curious because we hear about xenoestrogens, but are there not these chemicals that act as, progesterone or testosterone in our body? Is it primarily just?
There are androgens, anti-androgens. There are chemicals that interfere with thyroid hormone. So in particular, and at least in terms of thyroid, it's like anything that is a halogen, right? So iodine, which is our thyroid depends on, is a halogen. It's on the periodic table of elements. Well, so is chlorine, bromine, and fluorine.
Right.
So any chemicals that are chlorinated, brominated, or fluorinated can displace iodine in the thyroid, right? And so that's just an example of non-estrogenic necessarily chemical that can interfere with our hormones. But our thyroid is like this master thermostat and signaling. So like when your thyroid is messed, like
everything's messed up.
Everything's messed up, right? So but yes, there are some chemicals. I think BPA certainly is one of them that can interfere with testosterone in both men and women. This is why these chemicals are so linked to fertility problems, because testosterone is necessary for healthy fertility in both men and women, right? But specifically that they can interfere and lower testosterone levels in men is part of why, why we are hypothesizing that sperm counts in men are really struggling and dropping, and sperm health in general is really struggling, partly because of these synthetic chemicals that can either mess with testosterone or estrogen or both, also the thyroid. And so some of these chemicals,
aromatization happens a lot because of chemicals, right?
Right. And so you can have a single chemical that has multiple mechanisms of action. And the challenging part when it comes to translating that into an individual human is like, well, I don't know which pathway this exposure is going to show up in you. I don't know that. And I don't know if we have a way of predicting that, because something might mess with the thyroid, but also mess with your testosterone, but we don't know which path it's going to take, or maybe it takes both, or maybe it takes none. And there's so many, this is really where that individualized, like, let's look at one person's labs and let's look at this picture for you, and we'll do this intervention and then retest. And if we can see that, drop, those levels or what have you, then we can say, okay, then we know that this intervention is helpful for people. But with that said, when we are looking at intervention studies, which are where we are taking human populations primarily, and having them do something different, eat this food or don't eat that food, use these products, don't use those products. There's not enough intervention studies. In my opinion, we always need more of those because they're real practical science.
Right.
Like, let's see what happens when.
Yeah.
And so those studies are all showing that when we practice avoidance behaviors, which means in practical terms, choosing better products that don't contain some of these questionable ingredients, and we can get into, I don't know what your cutoff is or what the cutoff is, but we can get into where some of those things are showing up in the home. You can see levels drop. So there's a Hermosa study. It's an abbreviation for it's an acronym. I don't remember what for, but it was a study of Latina girls, young girls, teenage girls, and all the personal care products that they used, just the regular stuff.
Yeah.
And in this study, they said, okay, use those products for a week. We're going to measure your phthalate levels. We're going to measure your triclosan, your paraben levels in your urine. We're just going to do your regular thing. Then we're going to swap out those products with similar products, but that don't have those ingredients. And we're going to measure how long it takes and to what extent those chemicals are no longer measured in your urine. And I think it was a week. 2-week study, week here and a week there. And the different chemicals reduce at different percentages, but it was like a 30 to 40% reduction in a really short amount of time, in like a week, 5 days to a week. And my hunch is that if the intervention had also looked at laundry detergent, scented candles, air fresheners, which are also sources of those same chemicals, that reduction would have been more significant. But this was a skincare study.
And that's amazing how quickly the body can work too. If we just start to pull back.
This is where there is a distinction between persistent chemicals and non-persistent chemicals. So things like BPA and phthalates, even pesticides, the pesticides we're using now, they're non-persistent. That doesn't mean they're not toxic, and that doesn't mean that they're not problematic for the short time that they are in the body. They are,
right?
But the body can metabolize them quickly. The problem is that our levels are constant in the body. So the NHANES data, epidemiological data, looking at levels of chemicals and things in the human population, has found that phthalates and BPA are found in 95% plus of the population. So for a chemical that can be metabolized within 6 to 12 hours, that tells us that we're taking it in faster than our bodies
can get rid of it.
That's the takeaway. And so if we stop putting it in, then our body can flush it out on its own.
Right. So what are some of the other places we've talked about, some of the products and beds and everything? So the way that I always like to preface this is, let's start with the things that are free and easy. And the first one is always going to be scented candles and air fresheners. Like, just don't buy them. Just don't buy them. It's not just phthalates, which are endocrine disrupting chemicals. There's volatile organic compounds, toluene, benzene. These are carcinogens. They're a major source of indoor air pollution, which is worse than outdoor air. So don't get your spice pumpkin candle. Don't do it.
Don't do it. And don't just have them and not burn them. Throw them out, because even unburned, they are still, if you can smell it, it's volatile.
Right. Oh, makes sense.
So you don't have to burn it. It's just throw them out. Don't buy them ever again. That saves people money. So that's like the number one thing. From there, I try to look at what are the easier things to do in terms of these endocrine disrupting chemicals specifically is, one, minimize plastic in the kitchen. So don't put your food in plastic. Don't heat leftovers in plastic. Switch to glass containers. Don't drink out of plastic cups. Don't give your kids plastic cups and plates. You can get, I have these right here. They're almost indestructible. It's Corelle, which is actually glass. And these things, you can throw them on a concrete, they don't break. And they're and they make cups and plates and bowls and little kitty dishes. So if someone has children, they're inexpensive, and you don't want them to use plastic, but you also know that they're going to throw their plates around the house.
Right.
They do. then get something like a Corelle dish. And so minimizing plastic, that includes things like your cooking utensils. So those black plastic spatulas. We want to be looking ultimately at our cookware. So getting rid of those nonstick pans and really moving towards glass, stainless steel, cast iron, enameled cast iron, carbon steel. Like there's lots of other options that are better out there. Minimizing the use of canned foods. Canned foods are a significant source of BPA. I don't like to say don't have any canned foods because that's really hard. And there's a lot of populations that are like, yeah, but this is how we live.
Right. They need, exactly.
We do the best that we can. Similarly, saying no to cash register receipts, which might be a weird one, but that thermal paper, that inkless thermal paper is coated in free BPA, meaning it's not even bound to the matrix of the paper.
So it's just right through your skin.
And that's why you can tell the difference between how they feel. It feels powdery because you're literally just rubbing molecules of BPA between your fingers. It's really gross. So just don't put them in the recycling. They're not recyclable. They have to go in the trash. It contaminates the recycling stream with BPA. Then from that point, I would say if we're still in the kitchen, honestly emphasizing organic food when possible, because a lot of those organophosphate pesticides, even though the residues are small, we now know that those small exposures can be meaningful. A lot of those are endocrine disrupting. And then we can shift into household cleaners and personal care products. And what I usually tell people is use what you have, finish the bottle. And when you're done, go get something, just get something new. Don't feel like you have to
run out and get all the things right now.
Throw everything out at once. Certainly there's some people that are motivated to do that and they can afford to do that. Fine, great. But most people are not going to want to do that. And I think making that recommendation continues to make this topic inaccessible to a lot of people.
I agree.
And you know, the problem is the people that often need this information the most, partly because they have the highest exposures, also have the least access to healthcare and healthy food. And that's really where we move into this whole other side of the conversation, which is environmental justice, environmental racism, and that certain communities are disproportionately exposed for lots of different reasons. And those communities don't always have access. These are the communities where we can't go in and say, like, don't eat canned foods.
Right,
and, like,
exactly.
Their only grocery store might be a bodega that doesn't have any fresh food.
If they can even get canned foods. A lot of times it's just, candy bars and things like that. And in the liquor stores.
So again, personal care products, household cleaners. I mean, household cleaners to me is an easy one because you can actually just do vinegar,
soda, it's going to be a lot cheaper to do that.
So much cheaper. And especially for people that have any kind of respiratory issue, most of the conventional cleaners are really strong respiratory irritants. And even cleaning with vinegar can be a respiratory irritant for some people. But for the most part, people that have things like asthma in particular, or children that have asthma, getting rid of those strong fragrances in the home, getting rid of those strong chemical-based household cleaners, and swapping them for baking soda and vinegar and salts and all that kind of stuff, can actually lower hospitalization rates for children with asthma. So those are interventions that are actually hugely impactful, that are really cost effective. They're not expensive. They're accessible to most people. And so those are good interventions. And so those whole topics of like your food, your household cleaners, your personal care products, what you're putting your food in and your food itself. That's really, like, if that takes people a year or 2 years to kind of tick all those boxes, great. I always say tick those boxes off first and kind of get into a groove before you start even thinking about things like your carpeting and your furniture.
Right.
And those are all potential issues, but they're not issues that are easy.
Right.
To address.
That's overwhelming to dive.
So you just start with where you start. And if it takes, I always tell people I was doing this work for 7 years before I finally replaced my mattress.
Right.
Because I was like, well, that's really expensive.
It's expensive. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I'll get there when I get there. And, I wasn't laying in bed every night being like, oh my God, so toxic.
Right.
I was just like, all right, well, whatever.
Yeah.
I can't do anything.
I trust you, body, to deal with this. Yeah. As far as
and I think that goes back to really where we started, which is, stress is extremely toxic.
Yep.
And can be such a have such an impact on your hormones. And so there is an inclination when people step into this space to like freak out.
Yep.
And I'm here to be like, don't freak out. Don't freak out.
Take one thing at a time here.
One thing at a time, and don't try to do everything you can to stay away from that like anxiety maelstrom of worrying that everything is toxic and everything is going to kill you. One of the things that I have to remind my students all the time is that like not everything is a 4-alarm fire.
Right.
Like we have to learn to triage what's important and what's not, and where do I allocate my mental and resources and my financial resources, and where can I just go, okay, like I'm not going to worry about that.
Yep, absolutely. So, wow, this has been such an amazing, incredible amount of just such important information. I really thank you for sharing it with my listeners, because I know you brought together a lot of points that I think, are, you read something here, you read something there, and it doesn't all kind of gel together in your mind. So I just love everything that you're doing. I appreciate your work. People can actually take courses from you, right, at your website?
Yes. Yeah, my courses are designed for health professionals, but anybody can take them. It's not a requirement. But it's really with the health professional in mind. But
gotcha. But yeah, if you're like down to know all those sort of connections, it's a good place to go. So, all right, you guys, thank you so much for being with us today. And thank you. We'll see you next time.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.